Hello, everyone. Thank you for your interest in Lancaster Farmland Trust's webinar today, titled How the Trust Works with Farmers to Improve Water Quality. We thought this topic was especially important, recognizing today is Earth Day. So focusing on our environment and what we're doing to work with farmers to make improvements there, we thought was a really good topic. If you're not familiar with the Trust, we're a private nonprofit organization based in Lancaster County, have been in existence now for 32 years. We work with farmers really in two different perspectives. One is the preservation of their farm, permanently protecting it, keeping it from being converted into non-agricultural uses. And then about 15 years ago, we really elevated our work working with farmers related to how they manage their farm and the environmental impacts that their farm may have. So over the course of the last 15 years, providing technical and financial assistance to farmers to make those improvements. And I think today's presentation will give you some good insight on that type of work and what the challenges are that we have here in Lancaster County. Our two presenters today are Jeb Musser, our Director of Land Protection at the Trust. Jeb works on a daily basis with farmers related to the preservation of their farms, but then also oversees our work in terms of getting best management practices implemented, which we acquire funds through a variety of different sources: private contributions, foundation support, federal and state grants, and other means as well. And then our second presenter is Gordon Hoover, who is our Agricultural Outreach Coordinator. Gordon is our boots on the ground guy. He's out talking with farmers on a daily basis, not over the last 6 weeks because of the quarantine and COVID-19, but he's anxious to get back out there. But Gordon has a great background in agriculture, owns a farm in Salisbury Township, was a dairy farmer, worked for Land O'Lakes for a period of time, and is also a supervisor in Salisbury Township. So he brings a really good municipal perspective to our work as well, and how there's the interplay between our municipal sector and our ag sector. So just a few housekeeping items before we get things started. You can ask questions in the chat or the question panel at any time. We will take a break in the middle to answer a few quick questions in the chat box, and then have a full Q&A at the end of the session. You can also find a recording of this webinar on our YouTube page. There will be a link that will be sent later today, and you can also find the previous recordings of our past webinars on the YouTube page. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jeb, and he'll start the presentation.
All right, thanks, Jeff. So as Jeff mentioned, this is our third webinar here in a series that we've done the past few weeks. Today we're going to focus on how Lancaster Farmland Trusts assists with water quality efforts in Lancaster counties, and specifically assists farmers with water quality improvements to their operations. So what we're going to cover today is just a very kind of quick background on Chesapeake Bay regulations. Obviously, that in and of itself could be probably a multiple day conference on Chesapeake Bay regs and the history there. So, but just going to provide a quick background there for folks on the call who might not have a background on that. We're going to then kind of zoom in on Lancaster County, focus on Lancaster County's role in water quality, and then from there we're going to take that quick, maybe 2 or 3 minute break, see if there's any really pressing questions out there about those first two categories. But I would, we're going to save plenty of time at the end, hopefully for a more kind of in-depth Q&A. So if you have a question that can wait till the end, that's great. But if it's really pressing, certainly we'll take a few minutes to answer questions in the middle. Then I'm going to pass it over to Gordon. Gordon's going to talk about some common barriers that we see in the agricultural community for implementing best management practices on farms. What's maybe causing the slowdown of some practices getting implemented? And then I'm going to cover some specific case studies on actual farms that Lancaster Farmland Trust has been able to help best management practices get implemented. I'm going to talk about a few of those and with some photos and maps and whatnot. And then, like I mentioned, we'll have a longer Q&A period towards the end. So a little bit of background context here. So this map, it may be a little bit tough to see, but just general area here, and you can there's a white outline that you should be able to see, but it could be a little faded. This the Chesapeake Bay watershed begins up in the Cooperstown, New York area in the headwaters. Involves multiple state crosses multiple state boundaries: New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Washington, D.C. I think I got them all there. So covers 64,000 square miles, over 11,600 miles of shoreline, over 150 major rivers and streams, and home to over 18 million people. This information here, just some kind of environmental and economic benefits. The source of this information is from Chesapeake Bay Foundation. I'll say if you ever want to do a little bit more more in-depth research on Chesapeake Bay as a whole, Chesapeake Bay Foundation would be a great place to go to. There's lots of organizations dedicated to doing work in the Chesapeake Bay. They are just one of many. So forests found in the Chesapeake Bay watershed protect and filter drinking water for 75% of the watershed's residents, nearly 13 million people. The commercial seafood industry in Maryland and Virginia combined equals almost 3.4 billion in sales, 890 million in income, and nearly 34,000 jobs to the local economy. Health departments across the watershed continue to caution people to stay out of the bay after a heavier rain to avoid harmful bacteria and pollution. So that's obviously a sign that maybe there's not something that there's something wrong there that needs to be addressed. That if it's a health concern after a heavy rain, something that needs to be done. Millions find inspiration, rejuvenation, and solace in the Chesapeake Bay's waters. So, as you may have already understand, there are multiple sources of that can contribute to pollution in any water body, and that's the same for the Chesapeake Bay. So within the Bay watershed, there are a wide variety of land uses, obviously industrial uses, plenty of suburban, residential, urban uses, and then of course, especially in Lancaster County in our area, a pretty high acreage of agricultural use, all of which have kind of their own contributions to water quality. So again, all of these items here on this timeline could involve a little bit more research, looking back into them, but this just sets the stage a little bit. I obviously don't cover every step in the process. These are kind of my attempts to hit the high points. So the first Chesapeake Bay Agreement was signed by Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, DC, Chesapeake Bay Commission, and EPA in 1983. A second one ramping up those efforts was signed in 87. About 10, 11 years later, 1998, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation released the State of the Bay report card, rating it still only a 27 out of 100. So still not enough was getting done really to clean up the bay. It was really what came out of that. In the year 2000, EPA and partners signed the third agreement, placing a 2010 deadline for cleanup. By 2007, EPA and their partners, state partners and other partners, determined that those 2010 goals were likely not going to be met. We're not seeing enough progress from that third agreement. In 2009, EPA was sued by Chesapeake Bay Foundation and others, and in 2010, there was the landmark Chesapeake Bay TMDL, what stands for Total Maximum Daily Load, which we'll get into here in a little bit, was developed, which officially set limits on nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment that can enter the bay. And at that time, states within the Bay watershed submitted their Phase 1 Watershed Implementation Plan, or WIP. You'll hear WIP a lot in this presentation, but also really in any conversation related to the Chesapeake Bay and water quality efforts in Lancaster County, but also in Pennsylvania as a whole, and in the Bay watershed as a whole. 2012, states submitted their phase 2 WIPs. And in 2014, signing of the Chesapeake Bay Agreement brought in other partners. Just a few years ago in 2018, everyone convened for a midpoint assessment of the WIP progress. How are things coming along for this kind of upcoming deadline of 2025? Are we making enough progress? Are we going to meet our goals? Because who knows what might happen in 2025? That's when the bay needs to be cleaned up. I think it's a bit of an unknown what could happen if it does not get cleaned up. And then that 2025 date of practices to be in place, practices that improve water quality, improve the health of the Chesapeake Bay, and remove it from EPA's dirty water list. So what is a TMDL? I'm sure there are plenty of folks on the call who are familiar with this term, but for those who aren't, TMDL, like I mentioned, stands for total maximum daily load. Basically, I believe I've heard it termed as a pollution diet in the past. So it identifies sources of pollution, what's causing the pollution to occur in a certain water body, calculates amounts from each source, sets maximum pollutant load that particular water body can handle and still be considered clean. And then it identifies permit controls and what practices need to be put in place to mitigate the issue and ultimately clean up the bay. And then there's a monitoring component of that as well. So basically, how much pollutant can be going into the water body and it still be considered healthy. So again, we're moving into, sorry about that. Moving into, we're going to talk more about Lancaster County. So there's just an arrow shown where Lancaster City is located in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So you can see in the kind of the grand scheme of things, we're actually fairly close to the bay, especially in the southern end of Lancaster County. Lancaster County has its own share of pollutants that are going into the bay from a variety of sources. Obviously, we're focusing on agriculture, being that's where we do our work with farmland preservation and with assisting farmers with making improvements to their operations. So this graph can be a little bit kind of shocking at times, but really does tell the story on where we really need to invest our efforts. So you can see Lancaster County is kind of off the charts there when it relates to the amount of nitrogen that Lancaster County needs to reduce in order to meet those Chesapeake Bay 2025 goals. So as part of those WIPs that I mentioned, Pennsylvania has a WIP that they need to submit to EPA, Watershed Implementation Plan. And then Pennsylvania, DEP, their process is to break that down on a county level. Each individual county is responsible for their own action plan, which ultimately outlines how that county is going to address their portion of pollutant loads that are going into their water bodies. So Lancaster County, like I mentioned, off the charts when it comes to nitrogen, over double what number 2 York County is. So about 11 million pounds of nitrogen are needed to be reduced from going into the Chesapeake Bay on an annual basis, and 500,000 pounds of phosphorus. Still a large number, but obviously not anywhere close to that 11 million pounds. This can be kind of attributed to multiple different reasons. Lancaster County, obviously, high density of farms. It's a very largely agricultural community. We have some of the most productive non-irrigated soils in the United States. our farms, because our soils are so productive, combined with some of the cultural characteristics of our county, our farms tend to be smaller in size than other areas, a higher density of livestock, which then ultimately results in we have an excess of manure. And that oftentimes I hear that from my colleagues in the water quality world, that's the biggest issue we have. We have too much manure, or another way of looking at it is we don't have enough to do with our manure. Manure can be a resource, but maybe we need to be innovative about how we are able to use and market that manure. This map here just shows which streams in Lancaster County are on the impaired streams list. So the ones in red there are ones that are listed as impaired. So you can see quite a large amount of them are impaired, but you know, as we are implementing practices and others were doing this work in the county are implementing practices, the ultimate goal is to clean up the bay, but we're going to get there by delisting some of these streams from the impaired streams list. So current conditions in Lancaster County, as you saw on that chart the graph a few slides ago, Lancaster County is the highest loading, so pollutant loading, nitrogen, phosphorus, highest loading county in Pennsylvania's Chesapeake Bay watershed, with current loading rates of 27.2 million pounds of nitrogen, about 1.3 million pounds of phosphorus, and then those reduction numbers that are needed of that 11 million and 500,000 or 500,000 pounds of phosphorus. These figures are taken from Pennsylvania DEP's Phase 3 WIP snapshot for Lancaster County that was created. Lancaster County is one of the first counties kind of attacking their local plan for the Pennsylvania Watershed Implementation Plan process. So this is a snapshot from that. So Lancaster County's reduction initiative. So as part of the planning process for Lancaster County, there were different initiatives that were segmented out on what different areas do we need to focus on in order to meet these reductions. What best management practices can occur in these certain kind of sectors in order to meet those reductions. So the graph on the left there, the pie chart, just shows current land use breakdown in Lancaster County. So about half of the land of the total acreage in Lancaster County is in agricultural use. You'll notice on the right-hand side that 8 million pounds at the top is a lot larger than any other number on that page, obviously, except for the total. So the point I'm trying to make here is Lancaster County, 50% of the land use is in agriculture, but over 90% of the planned reduction as part of Lancaster County's plan for reducing their impact on the bay, it's being called for coming from agriculture. So there's a lot of work that agriculture can do, and we're certainly trying to do our part. And here's just some kind of common themes that I see in the conversation with Lancaster County, and honestly outside of Lancaster County a lot too, on how we steps we need to take to really move the needle here a little bit. So big one, increase manure storage capacity and refine time and rate of application of manure. It ties back to that manure issue that I talked about a few slides ago. There's major improvements that can be made to water quality, from excluding livestock from streams, participating in stream restoration programs, and planting trees and shrubs along the banks. If you remove the livestock from having direct access to the stream, obviously you're removing that direct discharge of nutrients into the water. Continuing to encourage no-till farming and cover crops and soil health. This is nothing new. There are many farmers in Lancaster County who have fully implemented no-till and cover crops. This is really just to continue that conversation. A key theme that I think Gordon Gordon preaches and our work is that we want to make the plan work for the farmer. We don't want to dictate exactly what the farmer, what you need to do, no matter how it works for your operation. We want to make the plan work for the farmer's operation, because ultimately that will increase the likelihood of those best management practices getting implemented. If it makes sense for the farmer and it works for everybody, it's a win-win. And then breaking down those barriers. So I'll take a quick kind of, Jeff or Laura, let us know if there are any kind of pressing questions right at this time, or if not, we can move over to Gordon.
Jeff, we do have one question that came through. The first question is there a market for Lancaster County's manure, such as selling it to make fertilizer?
Gordon, you want to cover that one?
Currently, there's not. There are some outlets for manure. The simplest opportunity is for broiler manure. So that'd be chickens that are raised for meat. And that manure tends to be drier. It's easier to transport. So there are some markets and some auctions actually where broiler manure is being sold and exported outside the county, specifically to cash croppers. Those are farmers who are just raising crops for grain sales. There was an innovative project that I think's been started north of Harrisburg, and that's a horticulture plant supplement process where they're importing, again, broiler manure using attributes from actually a landfill. So methane gas from an old landfill to create steam, some of the contaminated water that's high in sulfur to use as an additive to this manure to increase the sulfur nutrient levels in the product. So there's some innovative opportunities like that. The other one is some of the larger dairy farms in the county have methane digesters. We're trying to produce some of that methane in the manure to transition into energy sources, whether it's electric or a natural gas that can be used in combustible engines. So there are some opportunities out there. Lancaster County is predominantly dairy. Dairy has a lot of water in its manure. It's hard to export. So that's why there's a lot of focus on the poultry industry right now in a lot of those activities.
And we have one other question. It's, have there been any updates to the State of the Bay rating of 27 since 1998?
Actually, you know, I'd have to check in on that. I when I was kind of pulling together my information for this webinar, I didn't find anything related to that. I'm not sure, Jeff, if you've heard anything, but frankly, I don't know if I have the answer to that.
Pennsylvania has made progress. I don't know the exact rating, so we'll look into that and we can follow up with the individual who asked that question.
Okay.
That's all the questions we have for now. So we'll send it over to Gordon.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. My subject for today is common barriers to BMP implementation on farms. And I want to cover three. I think they're the main ones. I want to look at farmer outreach, funding for BMP implementation, and touch just a little bit on enforcement, how it can be used as a motivator. So farmer outreach, one of the challenges that we have is a lot of these conservation regulations and opportunities have been on the books for many years, up to 40, 50 years, but they've all been designed as voluntary programs. And so a lot of focus on outreach and education of farmers and farming operations, and then allowing farmers to voluntarily get their plans done, implement BMP best management practices. And one of the challenges is so if you look at farming as a commodity business, a lot of economic laws kind of apply. So 20% of the farms produce 80% of the product. It pretty much holds true in any commodity industry. And so those 20% of the producers that make 80% of the product are obviously the large farms. And 80% of the farms produce 20% of the product. That 80% of the farms tend to be the smaller farms, the ones that tend not to be quite as innovative or progressive. So at this point in time, DEP, EPA pretty much have those large farms regulated, especially if they're livestock operations with the large CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. They have a lot of registrations, permitting they have to go through. And so the smaller farms tend to be the focus that we need to take. And a lot of those farms are resistant to government intervention, rules and regulations. And even though we do a lot of outreach and education in this conservation field, a lot of those farms don't voluntarily come to meetings. They don't voluntarily fill out surveys. So it's hard to get at the data and help those farms. So one of the areas that LFT is really focused on has been farmer outreach. And specifically, we need to do more one-on-one farmer outreach with these farms. Since they don't want to come to meetings, the only way to get to them is to visit the farm physically, help them understand the regulations of conservation, the benefits of conservation. And so about 1.5 years ago, Lancaster Farmland Trust developed a one-on-one outreach program with farms where we can develop relationships with these farmers, help build a trust relationship, have folks with integrity, former farmers reach out to these guys, farmers that have implemented conservation programs. Because part of the issue is these smaller farms tend to be farms that aren't innovators, and you need to help them through the change cycle. If you step onto the farm and they use conventional tillage practices, and you tell them, hey, your system is broken, you need to fix it by implementing no-till practices, they'll look at you cross-eyed because, well, my system's not broke. I still get good crops. I have excellent farming techniques here. But you have to help them through the change cycle to understand the value of this long-term investment in conservation practices. So that's one of the big examples and where we need to get to in completing the rest of compliance to all farms. We physically have to get out on these farms, and that's where Lancaster Farmland Trust, through this one-on-one outreach program, is trying to break that barrier, help farmers hold their hands, and connect them to the next topic I want to talk about, which is funding. A lot of farms, especially our smaller farms, tend to be very cash strapped. They don't have the cash flow to implement these BMPs, the best management practices on their farms, even to some extent to get plans written for their farms. So funding is a challenge. There are a lot of great programs through the state and through different grant programs to provide funding for these farms, and many farms have taken advantage of it. A lot of the challenge is getting farms connected with these funding programs. Again, as I said, a lot of our larger farm operations have taken advantage of these programs because they've been innovative. And again, they've been involved with a more rigorous compliance because of their large number of livestock and acreage. So again, this one-on-one relationship we're trying to build with farms, one of our goals is to help them get plans and also get funding to implement the BMPs that are listed in those plans. A great example of this challenge is a lot of conservation best management plans or programs or things you want to install on the farm are a long-term investment. And so they don't have a quick return on investment, but they do add long-term value to the farming operation. Since a lot of these farms are cash poor, basically, it's a challenge for them to generate cash within their operation to fund these best management practices. Manure storage is a great example. You take a small 40-50 cow dairy farm, it could cost anywhere up to $150,000, $200,000 to implement barnyard improvements and proper manure storage. They just don't have the cash to invest in that, since once they install that, the cash return, the cash flow back to their operation is a very long-term return. And so funding is a barrier to a lot of farms, but we have a lot of great funding opportunities right now to help these farms. One of the challenges that has just popped up now is due to the actual pandemic situation, the coronavirus. The government is investing a lot of dollars to prop up the economy right now. And so that's going to put a lot of these government funded grants and cost share programs at risk. So that's one of the things we really have our eye on right now, is what's going to happen with a lot of these funding sources and the momentum that we've had to date in applying for these funds and getting them on farms to implement best management practices. So that's something we have our eye on. One of the last topic I'd like to touch on just a little bit is enforcement. As I mentioned before, a lot of these programs have really been designed for voluntary implementation, for farms to participate on a voluntary basis. Again, I think they were designed that way years ago, just with the understanding that a lot of farms do have cash flows that vary from time to time, season to season, year to year, and this allows the farmer to voluntarily participate when he has the opportunity to improve his operation. Again, as I mentioned, the 80-20 rule. So the 20% of the large farms that have large livestock numbers on their farms, about 25 years ago, EPA and DEP decided to ramp up their efforts on enforcement, and they started with these large farms. And the implementation at that time was focused on the large farms. We'll reach out to them first, and the goal was to move into the smaller farms as time went on. They got the large farms, those programs of enforcement implemented, but never made it down to the small farms. So a lot of our focus right now is on these small farms that, for the most part, don't have plans and haven't implemented a lot of the BMPs that those plans require. What's really been a boon to breaking some of this barrier of getting small farms involved lately has been a enforcement or a program that DEP started here in the state several years ago of inspecting farms to see if they have plans and to help them get their plans so they're in compliance from a plan standpoint. Most small farms know somebody who had a visit from DEP and had to scramble to get their plans done. And so that has encouraged them to get their plans done. But usually it takes that one-on-one visit to help them through the process, to kind of hold their hand, encourage them. And they're usually very willing, but they just need a little help along the way. And so that's one of the things that we've really tried to work on. When I talk about plan enforcement, I'm not talking about punitive, fining people and dropping the hammer on them, but just setting up programs that let farmers know that it's time to get these programs and best management practices in place. And I think what we're going to see is maybe this prototype that Lancaster Farmland Trust has developed with one-on-one outreach grow and be extended into other municipalities and other organizations, because that's the only way we're going to get the last of these farms compliant and on board. One of the other challenges is that there's such a turnover in staffing in some areas, and farmers like to work with somebody they trust. And so having somebody on that farm every year, which is our goal at the end of the day, just to remind them of the work they need to do, to hold them accountable of the manure records and crop records they need to do, from a trusted relationship, I think will really help us gain a lot in compliance and obviously benefiting water quality. So the three areas I mentioned: farm outreach, developing that one-on-one relationship, helping farmers through the journey; funding, which is a barrier to all farms; and then finally, the effects of using enforcement to help motivate farmers to get compliant more than a punitive action. But we need to have that enforcement there to drive that. So I'll let it go at that, Jeb, I could talk on this the rest of the day, but that gives you a little taste of some of the barriers and the things that we're trying to do at Lancaster Farmland Trust to break down the barriers.
All right, thank you very much, Gordon. Yes, as Gordon said, that could in and of itself be probably a webinar topic, and trying to squeeze that in the 10 minutes to just kind of hit the high points. So thanks, Gordon. So lastly here, before we get into some questions and answer, I wanted to just highlight actually a few different projects that Lancaster Farmland Trust has worked on over the years with farmers. So the first one, we received some funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Also kind of coupled that funding with Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection funding and some others, kind of to create a pot of money for some work to be done on 6 farms in the Peck Way Creek watershed. So the Peck Way Creek, for those of you maybe not familiar with Lancaster County as much as others, Peck Way Creek is spans the entire width of Lancaster County from east to west, kind of just southeast of Lancaster City there. Headwaters are up in the Gap, Salisbury Township area, and then it does eventually drain into the Susquehanna. This map just kind of zooms in there. As much of Lancaster County is, and this is a pretty heavily agricultural area, so that kind of medium green color you see on the map is our agricultural land use types. The purple or residential, and you can kind of see the rest there, but the vast majority of land use in this watershed is agriculture. So I'm going to highlight 2 farms that we worked on through this project. We did a lot of outreach in the watershed kind of prior to this, and selected some farmers that had a good combination of interest and willingness to work with us, but also had some significant needs on their farms as far as nitrogen and phosphorus loading is concerned. So first one, we're calling it the Blank Farm. It is a 75-acre dairy operation, so growing support crops and tobacco. So a pretty common farm that you see in Lancaster County. Dairy operation, 70-ish acres, and growing a cash crop of tobacco. When we first met with the Blank family, their kind of issues that they were seeing were they had inadequate manure storage. So again, pretty common theme at times when across dairy operations. So they had a manure storage that allowed them to store, I believe it was up to maybe 6 weeks, maybe as long as 2 months they could store their manure. But after that period of time, they would have to go out in the fields and spread it. So depending on the time of year, it could be the ground could be very frozen, it could be snow covered, it could the ground just really may not be in the best conditions to actually soak up and utilize those nutrients in that manure. So not enough manure storage. They had heavily degraded animal use areas and walkways. So areas where the animals were congregating, whether it be for feeding or what have it, or for traveling as far as the walkways go, were severely degraded. There was some concrete that existed for these heavy use areas, but it was pretty chunked up, and there was no real edge controls on those concrete areas for when manure piled up in there and it rained, and that would just cause a kind of a runoff issue, or as Gordon refers to them, quote unquote, leaky barnyards. And then there was some kind of additional erosion concerns outside of the farmstead area that was occurring in the cropland. So kind of multiple issues going on here. But at the end of the project, we were able to fund and help implement with our partners an increased manure storage capacity, where the Blanks no longer had to spread as often. They could bridge those winter months and spread the manure at a time when the ground was able to actually soak it up and use it, and the crops were able to soak it up and use it as well. So that was kind of the main project there. We also constructed an improved roof structure and manure transfer system for handling that manure when it's not in the storage. Improved those animal walkways with geotextile and stone. Put new concrete on the heavy use areas or the barnyards, and put curbing around those areas too, to prevent that runoff from occurring times of heavy rains or things like that. Some smaller projects as well. Oftentimes we'll take the time when we're doing a BMP project on a farm to assess the gutters and stormwater controls around the farmstead. Are there gutters on the barn? Are the gutters functioning properly? If we're going to address the runoff issues when it's related to the barnyard or a manure handling issue, we want to make sure that we're directing water in the most appropriate places from the buildings as well too. So, and then a grassed waterway in a crop field. So a grassed waterway basically is planting a strip of grass where water would typically run off the fields and create a gully in the field, planting that in grass and not actually planting that area in crops and not cultivating it at all, and therefore would slow down the flow of water and therefore the likelihood of erosion in that area. So some photos here. This is a before photo of that barnyard area. You can see there's no curbing on the edge here. There's a lot of manure that if it rains hard could potentially run out of there, and pretty even the concrete that does exist is pretty chunked up and in need of repair. This is the after photo. So the barnyard was kind of sunk down in a little bit and also created some curbing areas, especially on the back side. It's kind of tough to see in this picture. Also created a new small barn for the heifers on this. There was no dedicated structure for his heifers, so they're able to now have an area dedicated to themselves. But this is, and then you can see in the forefront, we also just kind of as part of this project also improved his field lane, his driveway there. That was eroding as well. So you can see we improved that while we were at it. Just another angle here. And again, this is just one of the BMPs or best management practices that we implemented. That list on the previous slide had a lot of others, but for sake of time, we're just covering one. So all said together, that the best management practice project on the blank farm resulted in reductions of 15,336 pounds of nitrogen, just under 6,000 pounds of phosphorus, and about 14,500 pounds of sediment for over 6 years. Another farm as part of this project was the Glick farm. So similar to the blanks, a little bit smaller, 61-acre dairy operation, growing support crops and tobacco. Again, pre-project conditions, inadequate manure storage, in this case only had capacity for 30 days. So the Glicks were spreading pretty frequently, a heavily degraded animal walkway, and then degraded barnyard and animal heavy use areas, among other things. Those were kind of the main things I pulled out though. So projects that we implemented, best management practices we implemented. So we increased the manure storage capacity for the existing manure storage. And then in addition to that, constructed a new satellite manure storage. So if you look on the map on the right-hand side of your screen, the aerial photo was taken prior to this project, but the new manure pit the satellite pit is up kind of in the area of the wooded patch there. So he's no longer he doesn't have to haul manure up to those fields. He can spread right from there, and it also increases his capacity, which is important to being able to time his manure application. Concrete then curbed the barnyard with that kind of additional manure storage underneath it. Improve those animal access lanes, concrete then curbed animal heavy use areas, and then like the blanks, assess the roof gutters and stormwater controls as well. So this photo is a little blurry, but this kind of shows the one building that I wanted to get a photo that had the same building in it that you'll see in the after photo. This is a before photo, so obviously they're in the process of, I think, redoing the roof on this building here. But you can see no real concrete or curbing area on the left-hand side there. Animals just kind of hanging out. This is the before photo of the animal walkway area. Some after photos, so you can see the farmstead there in kind of the backdrop. So this just shows that satellite manure pit up on the top of the hill. So obviously there were some, so he now has manure storage in 2 different areas of his farm, which is helpful. And here's that same building that was in that first photo. You can see the new concreted heavy use area with the curbing to help control runoff of all that brown stuff that you see in the photo there. So Glick Farm resulted in 14,000. It's similar reductions to the blank farm, a little bit more in sediment reductions for over 6 years. These are just some examples of some other projects, some of which were funded by this work, by other funding, but just some other examples of best management practices that we've helped implement on farms. So this one's a roof to manure stacking area. You can see the photo on the left. You can see kind of the water mixed with manure running out from the bottom of that pile, and it's assumed that eventually makes it into the stream. And then the photo on the right creates an area that keeps the rainwater out of there, keeps things nice and clean and organized for the farmer to use his manure when it's most appropriate. This is a little bit. I don't believe this is dairy manure. I'd have to check on this, but this is just a little bit of a different example. But that's not as wet of manure that Gordon was speaking about. And then some other examples. The photo on the left is a livestock stream crossing. So there are a lot of small streams on farms in Lancaster County, and streams aren't always the end of a farm operation. There's oftentimes need to cross the stream, both with animals and with equipment. So this is one way that we are having a dedicated area for these animals to cross the stream, to access water at times, but not necessarily access to the full stretch of the stream. So these are actually concrete. There are hog slats that are laid down in the stream at an angle, help stabilize the banks from erosion when the animals or the equipment is actually crossing. And then the one on the photo on the right, this is actually a small buffer planting that actually occurred on a preserved farm, but a farm that was participating in a grant with us. Just the other day, this was planted. You can see all the tree tubes there, and you can't see it in the photo, but there are a couple of livestock stream crossings farther down this stretch of stream too. And then the animals are fenced out of the streamed area too. So results from that Peck Way Creek project. So as I mentioned, it was a total of 6 farmers. I only highlighted 2 of them. So there were 4 other projects that were as part of that kind of bigger project. So in total, we assisted those 6 farmers with BMP implementation, resulted in 67 BMPs being put in the ground, included stream buffers, no-till, concrete, barnyard and heavy use areas, manure storage units, gutters and downspouts, stabilized cattle crossings, grass waterways, terraces, and more. Total reduction numbers on an annual basis. So those ones I showed you earlier were over for blank and Glick were over 6 years. This is an annual reduction amount of 11,349 pounds of nitrogen, 5,536 pounds of phosphorus, and 121,080 pounds of sediment. And then there you can kind of see the price tag. I will say the caveat of those of you who have worked with grants, so a large portion of this money was used, a vast majority of it used for design, engineering, and construction of best management practices. So actually the engineering work and paying of contractors to put the practices in the ground, buy the materials, those kind of things. Obviously there's a portion of these dollars that are built in for paying for the work that we do, paying for our staff time, paying for our work as well. So that total amount there isn't necessarily the cost of putting in 6 manure storage units with some other BMPs, but the vast majority of those dollars were used for actually putting practices in the ground. So the key takeaway here is, if you remember way back towards the beginning of the presentation, that graph that showed the amount of nitrogen that Lancaster County is responsible for reducing as part of the Pennsylvania Phase 3 WIP. A lot of dollars in this project invested into these projects, and so you can when you start running the numbers and doing the math on how much money achieving those reduction goals, how much money that might require, it can be a little bit mind-boggling. So that's kind of a key takeaway. These graphs kind of these are from a few years ago. This was my effort to quantify all of kind of the water quality projects that Lancaster Farmland Trust has helped fund over the years. We've been at this type of work for probably, I don't know, Jeff, maybe 15 years now or so. So the green portion of this circle is the portion of LFT projects that have the amount of nitrogen reductions that our projects have been able to achieve. The rest of the red shows those WIP reduction goals. So again, kind of highlighting that it's going to be a big effort. We're doing our part, but ultimately it's going to take multiple organizations, farmers, government officials, everybody working together to achieve this. No one person or no one organization can certainly achieve that goal in and of themselves. Here's phosphorus, not quite as small of a green sliver, but still there. So that's a quick highlight of that project, and a quick highlight of the water quality work that we do. Again, we've been at it for probably 15 years now in the water quality sphere. Where, you know, I think a lot of folks think of us as a farmland preservation organization, which we certainly are. That's how we identify. But we also can be a technical resource and an educational resource to farmers, both preserved and non-preserved. So I guess I will pass it back to Jeff and see if there's if anyone has any questions.
Great, thanks, Jeb. We do not have any questions through the question box, but feel free. I think Laura was going to unmute everyone. If you have a question, feel free to offer that, or again, feel free to send it through the chat or the question box. I just wanted to add, you know, we have found that our outreach related to water quality efforts have also put Lancaster Farmland Trust in a very good position of preserving some of those farms that we've worked with. And in both examples, the Blank Farm and the Glick Farm, the Glick Farm was preserved, and that relationship then led to the implementation of those BMPs because we had that existing trusting relationship with the farm family. In the case of the Blank Farm, they inquired with us about the water quality improvements and implementing best practices, and through that work led to the actual preservation of the farm. So we've seen a great sort of marriage between our efforts of permanently preserving these farms and ensuring they have those best management practices in place. Not seeing any other questions come through. We'll take a minute here to see if anybody has any questions they would like to propose. There was one question that came through that Jeb touched on briefly, which was really in terms of those projects. There was funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. There was also dollars through DEP through their Growing Greener program. And the question was how much private investment were in some of these projects. Obviously, we always try and encourage landowners if they're capable of private investment. That certainly helps, especially for all of these grants require some level of match with different requirements associated with them. What we find in a lot of cases, and these projects are from a few years ago, really when the dairy industry was hit hard. And the stark reality is that Many farmers do not have the cash flow resources and capital resources to be able to make these types of investments, and are really, focusing on how do they pay mortgage payments and feed bills and vet bills, and really, again, are in a difficult position to try and take on these large capital projects, as Gordon referenced earlier. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions come through. Oh, we just had one that came through. It says, does no-till plowing make it more difficult for manure to be absorbed by the ground? Gordon, I think I'll let you take that one.
No, no-till farming, no-till planting really helps build the soil structure, rebuild the soil structure. And when you plow ground, you break down the soil structure. So a healthy soil structure has a lot of porosity in it from earthworms, decaying roots. So when you apply manure to the top of no-till ground, the liquid out from that manure will incorporate into the ground much faster. When you apply manure to a conventional till field, yes, if it's just plowed or you plowed over, it will stay in that top 6 inches or so. But when you conventional till, you tend to get what we call a hard pan or a plow pan at that 6-inch depth, where you continuously manipulate the soil above that level, and then you get a hard pan. So any water or rain that falls on that soil reaches that hard pan and reaches a barrier, and then those nutrients in the water will move laterally off the farm. Whereas with healthy soil, through no-tilling and the restructuring, the rebuilding of that soil structure, that porosity goes beyond that 6 inches into your substructure, your soil, your subsoil, where roots can get at it, and your soil holds those nutrients better. And so that's kind of the nuts and bolts behind no-till and conventional till and manure application.
We do have another question that came through. Thanks, Gordon, for that. Are there any special tax incentives in terms of implementing these BMPs? Not to my knowledge, there's not any tax incentives related to this. Obviously, when a farm is preserved, there can be some tax benefits there, but not for the implementation of BMPs. Gordon, you have input?
I will mention that there's a new incentive that's being developed right now, and that's carbon sequestration. So when you no-till soil, that soil will hold the carbon better than when you plow soil. And when you plow soil, that carbon will start to evaporate basically as you turn that soil up. And so there are some programs right now through grant-funded situations where farmers can receive an outright payment for their no-till practices and enhancing the soil health and structure and sequestering that carbon. So that's a new development that's starting to occur, just being it's in the development processes now and starting to be rolled out. That's the closest thing that we have to an incentive type program for no-till practices.
Great. Thanks, Gordon. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions, and we have about a minute until we're supposed to conclude the webinar. So I would like to thank all of the attendees for your interest in this topic. Again, especially on Earth Day, we thought this was a really relevant topic. Want to express our thanks to Jeb and Gordon for taking us through the presentation and for your leadership related to this. Certainly, if you would like to view the webinar or share it, again, it will be on our YouTube page, and a link will be sent out later today. Also on our YouTube page, there are all the previous webinars as well. So I'd like to thank you. We hope that you are safe and well during this unusual time with the COVID-19 crisis. If you're a current supporter of Lancaster Farmland Trust, thank you for that support. We greatly appreciate it. If you're not and you thought this information was valuable, and in a position to make a contribution to the trust, feel free to go to our website where you can make an online donation. We would greatly appreciate that. We will have another webinar next week, so plan to see information on that coming out in the near future. So again, thank you for your attendance, and we hope to see you at our next webinar.